So Kristi Thompson, is the data librarian at the University of Windsor, and she was a co-editor of the book Data Librarianship, the Academic Data Librarian in Theory and Practice. Kristi has been invited to lead workshops on data management, quantitative literacy, and related topics in local, national, and international arenas. Her interest in data de-identification came about in part through her work with the Ontario Data Rescue Group, which is a pretty important effort and a model for some of the other data rescue efforts that are underway across the globe. Our second speaker, so Kristi will go first. Our second speaker is Manolis Terrovitis. Manolis is a researcher at the Research Center in Athens, Greece. He has an IT background, has been working in data management research since 2002. And for the last 10 years, Manolis has been working on privacy and data anonymization. He's leading the development of Amnesia, which he'll give a brief demo of today, which is a free anonymization tool that's been used in various EU-funded research projects. So with those intros, Kristi, I'll ask you to go ahead, and once you're done, we'll give Manolis a few minutes to get his slides shared.
Okay, thank you very much, Mark. Just checking you can hear me.
Sorry, I was muted. Yes, we can hear you just fine.
Okay, thank you. So, as you've heard, I'm Kristi Thompson. I'm going to be talking about data de-identification and anonymization. I want to emphasize first that I am not an expert in this topic, and I originally came to it as someone who knew very, very little about it, and I'm going to be speaking from that perspective, so nothing too technical here. I'm going to start with just a few of the key concepts that you need to get a handle on before you can really know what I'm talking about when I talk about data anonymization and de-identification. Anonymization is the word used for the permanent removal of identifying information with no retention of the identifying information separately. So if you have a data set, you take anything in it that could possibly be used to identify one of the people in the data set and remove it permanently, completely gone, can't get it back, that's it. De-identification is the creation of a version of the data set with the identifying information removed, while identifying information is retained separately. And generally, there will be some form of linkage, or you can revert to the original data set. Part of the motivation for this webinar, for this topic, is the fact that in Canada, our tri-agency is starting to, our Tri-Council, one of our major funding agencies, is planning to start requiring that researchers share their data once they've concluded their research, any data that was collected with public funds. So one of the things I do want to underline, because I keep being asked about it, is that permanent retention of identifying information is not required under any anticipated change to tri-agency policies. They want anonymized data to be archived and shared. A bit more about identifiers. A direct identifier is something like a name, address, a telephone number, maybe a social media handle or something, an unaltered photograph, or any identifier used by the researchers to link data to one of the above. So something that you could just take and look a person up and you'd find out who they were. A quasi-identifier is anything that has the potential to be linked with other data sources to violate the confidentiality of a person. So a set of variables that could be used as descriptors to identify someone, such as age, gender identity, income, occupation, ethnic variables, income variables, and so on. A variable should only be considered a quasi-identifier if an attacker, someone who's trying to violate the confidentiality of a data set, could plausibly match that variable to information from another source. Unfortunately, the range of quasi-identifiers that could be matched to something or other is rather larger than you might realize. Some variables may be used to derive other quasi-identifiers as well. So for example, a community size variable could be combined with some other broader geographic groupings to infer more precisely exactly what town or city somebody came from. Another key term you need to know, equivalence class. A set of records that has the same values on all quasi-identifiers in the data set is called an equivalence class. Okay, why is this important? Risk. Risk is created when variables can isolate individuals in a data set. Identifying information can be matched to persistent information that an attacker may reasonably have access to, and linking the two, the research data and the outside data, will give the attacker more information than they would otherwise have. I mentioned earlier that the class of quasi-identifiers is broader than you might think of at first. Social science researchers are used to thinking of things like demographic variables, but the scope of data is much larger than that. With internet and social media data, you can identify an individual by something like their computer. You can identify their computer and link that back to a location or a person. You can also identify data unique to a social media account. There was a fairly well-known case where people were identified using things like lists of their favorite books and movies, and I've got a reference here to an article that I can forward if interested. The basic issue, however, remains the same. Information that somehow can be linked to outside information. Non-identifying information are things that is data in a data set not likely to be recognizable as coming from a specific individual or to show up in any other database. So usually questionnaire responses, opinions, ratings, anything measured with a Likert scale is probably not going to be identifying information. You can't go and look somebody up by the rating of 3 on how happy they were with the service they got somewhere. Also, temporary measures are not identifying information. Someone's measured resting heart rate after meditation is not identifying. It may be unique to that individual at that point in time, or if not unique, at least specific, but it's not identifying. The number of times someone ate breakfast last week is not identifying. You can't look that up anywhere else. Qualitative data, qualitative interviews are a bit of a special case. You need to consider them individually. A response to a survey, a free text comment saying something like, the library needs more electrical outlets, that's not identifying. I think pretty much anyone who comes to our library has probably said that at some point or other. However, let's say you have a transcribed qualitative interview that was conducted by a particular person in a particular context, and it has a comment something like, and when I spoke to my colleagues at the plant about organizing a union, well, it's quite possible that someone might know exactly who's being talked about here. So that's what risk is, that's what leads to risk in a data set. How do you assess risk and how do you deal with risk? You can do this different ways. You can do it using mathematics, or you can do it by following various rules of thumb that have been developed. Start with the basics for assessing quasi-identifiers. Quasi-identifying variables containing groups with very small cell sizes, such as a religion variable that has 6 individuals responding that their religion was Buddhism, pose a high risk. Extreme values, someone saying on a survey that they had 12 children, a very, very high income value, that's also something that's going to pose high risk. The size of identifiable groups in the general population also needs to be considered. There may be only one person from Winnipeg in your random digit cell phone user survey, but if your survey doesn't narrow it down any further than that, that person is pretty safe. There are a lot of people in Winnipeg. However, contextual information that accompanies the data should also be part of the analysis. You can't just assess the risk of a dataset by looking at what's in the dataset. If it's clear from the context of your research that all your interview subjects worked at a particular tool and die plant in Oshawa, that's going to narrow things down quite a bit. Some general heuristics that are population-based. Geographic information should not be released if there are less than 20,000 people living in the geographic area. This is an official standard used by the U.S. Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act, better known as HIPAA. But similar standards are used by Statistics Canada, by the U.S. Census Bureau, and various other organizations. Also, if the quasi-identifier values represent less than 0.5% of the population, then these values represent a rare group, and response values on the quasi-identifiers should be generalized or the observations in the dataset suppressed. This is the rule used by Statistics Canada to top code age at 89 in various public use datasets, for example. Note also that category sizes that are small enough to violate confidentiality are also of limited or no research value. Okay, common sense or descriptive. This is kind of the, yes, that's obvious now that you tell me rule. Just look at the demographic variables in the data set and consider describing an individual to a friend using only the values of those variables. Is there any likelihood that the person would be recognizable? Let's say you could look at the variables in the describing an individual, I'm thinking of a person living in Toronto who is female, married, has a university degree, is between the ages of 40 and 55, and has an income between $60,000 and $75,000. Not recognizable. Even if there is only one person who matches those characteristics in the dataset, not recognizable. Unless contextual information about the dataset narrows things down further. Let's say that you know that this is a survey of referees for the Ontario Hockey Association. Whoops, there goes your risk way up again. Okay, when you're just thinking about the information that is internal to the dataset, when you aren't considering contextual information, the concept of K-Anonymity comes into play. K-Anonymity is a mathematical approach to demonstrating that a dataset is or is not anonymized. The concept is, it should not be possible to isolate fewer than K individual cases in your dataset based on any combination of identifying variables, where K is an integer set by the researcher. Generally, K will be not less than 5, and it may be set as something higher. That is, a record cannot be distinguished from K-1 other records. If you have one record that has a particular set of values on these variables, there will be at least K-1 other values in the data set that are exactly the same. There are several software programs in development to automate checking this. I've tested quite a few of them, and they often don't work very well on real data sets because this kind of checking can be difficult. However, if you have a very limited set of variables, you can use cross-tabulations in a statistical package such as SPSS or Stata to figure this out yourself. But again, for very large numbers of variables with large numbers of categories, checking K-anonymity yourself can be a challenge. One thing you should consider asking the researcher, though, is why are you collecting all that demographic information? What do you think this is, the census? Researchers should generally not be collecting potentially identifying information that is not actually needed for their study. K-anonymity may also be overkill, depending on dataset external factors, as well as being time-consuming to assess. Remember that contextual thing I was talking about. The survey of employees of the particular tool and die plant is much higher risk than the survey of the general population of Canada, whether or not the data meets some particular level of K-anonymity or not. Once you've identified some quasi-identifiers as potentially risky based on heuristics, K-Anonymity, or anything else, you need to do something about them. Usual strategies include top coding of outliers, so having a category of age 80 plus, grouping into categories such as age in 10-year increments, or deletion of outlier cases that cannot be grouped into any existing categories. If you look at the literature, there are a lot of other strategies that have been recommended. Adding random noise is one. You can add or subtract a random number following a Gaussian distribution from a numeric variable, for example, income, so that you end up with an income distribution that is like the original one, but doesn't actually match the original people. This maintains the overall distribution of the data, but changes the error term in the data in a way that is opaque to the researcher who may later want to use this data set. Value substitution. This is taking a value from one record in the data set and exchanging it with that of another record. This maintains the univariate distribution of values in the data set. If you started off with 27 responses of 3, you'll end up with 27 responses of 3. However, this may change bivariate or multivariate distributions. You need to trust the algorithm that no other errors are introduced. Some statisticians really love these things, but they have not gained much traction among researchers, at least among social science researchers that I'm familiar with. Okay, I want to walk you through a couple of basic case studies that'll help illustrate what I've been talking about. This first case comes from my work with the Data Rescue Group, a historical government survey. This survey became available to me, I won't say how. It had somehow not been de-identified by the survey firm employed by the government agency, which was the usual practice. The primary issue, the one we first noticed with it, was the presence of a number of geography variables. However, this survey was not in general of extremely high risk because the contextual information is that the survey was a general survey of the Canadian population. Also, it was a historical data survey, so the data was not recent. Some other people and myself undertook to de-identify this data set by hand. Our procedure was, we started by removing census geography, things like area codes. We removed area codes, which happened to be present. We grouped provinces into regions where necessary. So we grouped the maritime provinces, Nova Scotia, Prince Edward Island, and so on, into one category of maritime. And we ended up with the only geography in the data set was at the province or provincial grouping level. I think we also kept urban and rural. The data set also contained indirect community identifiers such as community size, which was quite precise. We dropped those as well. I mean, if you've got the exact population of a particular community in as of a particular year, you can probably use that to deduce, perhaps not precisely, but you can probably use that to deduce what the community might have been. So again, we turned that into just an urban-rural indicator. We regrouped the categories on demographic variables such as education and employment. Fortunately, in this particular case, we were able to use similar published surveys from the same agency that had undergone correct review as a model for how to do the grouping. And then after we had completed this grouping, we verified the demographic variables that were left in the data by cross-tabulating them using a statistical package. I did this myself, and then I had another person repeat the process independently. Okay, another example, an extract from a cardiology program database. This survey was quite different. There were only a few demographic variables that we were working with and an awful lot of variables dealing with things like heart rate under various different conditions. However, the contextual information made this data set quite high risk. It was data from a particular cardiology program, which meant that it was a program that was conducted in a particular region, and there was a known age range of participants. The original marital status variable frequency distribution on the data set looked like this. As you can see, the separated category was quite small. The other categories also could help narrow down the groupings in combination with the other demographics. So I ended up suggesting to the research group that they group the variable into living with spouse, yes or no. Practically speaking, that happened to be what mattered for the analysis. Did the person have the support of a spouse or not? Don't retain demographic information you don't need. The ethnic group category had 7 categories on it, 7 possible responses. Many of them were quite small. This is what our final grouping ended up looking like. We classified everyone into African American, Caucasian, and other. African American was a subgroup of interest. The researcher also had Hispanic as a subgroup of interest. This was an American data set. However, there were only 20 cases, and basically it was not feasible to retain that variable. The education variable. This one had a really large set of categories, some quite infrequent or even what I might call strange. This didn't happen on this data set, but I once came across a data set with an education variable that had a category for attended Swedish normal school, which is a very, very specific thing, and it wasn't a Swedish data set. We ended up grouping it into high school or less, some post-secondary and post-secondary degree, which is not an uncommon grouping. Deciding exactly who went into which of these based on their text response to that question was a little bit complex, actually, more than you'd expect. Some notes on these experiences. In the cardiology dataset, if the researchers followed my recommendations, the cardiology dataset would end up with no equivalence classes among the quasi-identifier variables smaller than about 20, k equals 20, as I remember. It was possible for me to do this by hand because of the relatively small number of demographic variables present. However, given that this data set is of a small known population, the data will not be widely distributed. This was just about getting it to the point where a broader research team could work on it. With the historical government survey, the data set was more complex, but also it was larger, more respondents, and was a general population survey, so it was of lower risk to begin with. Also, in that case, we had a model to follow that had been used on many similar data sets done by the same organization. So we didn't have to spend hours figuring out what would be the most advantageous way to group the education variable. Final observations. Manual de-identification of data is difficult and time-consuming, and the difficulty increases exponentially with the number of potentially identifying variables present. I downloaded and tested a number of free software packages that have been developed to assist with de-identification. For someone at my level of knowledge, all of them were too complex, buggy, or poorly documented to be of much help, although the package Amnesia, which you will be hearing about shortly, seemed like the most promising of them. Software that is aimed at the general academic survey researcher should not assume special knowledge in the field of data de-identification. The people who are developing these software packages need to realize that the person who is using them is probably not going to have a degree in mathematics. Software that is aimed at professional survey firms, which was the case for some of the packages I was looking at, can probably assume a much higher level of training. Thank you for listening. Over to Manolis.
And Kristi, while Manolis is getting his slide deck shared, I'm thinking we have one question at this point in the Q&A, so maybe I'll just ask it while Manolis is getting ready. So Manolis, you go ahead and get started. The question is, what is your opinion of the pseudo-anonymization, which replaces identifiers with pseudonyms or identifiers that are generated by the researcher?
What do you mean by my opinion of it?
I'm assuming, is it effective or is it a suitable?
Basically, it depends on how secure the wall between the non-anonymized data and the de-identified data is. It's if the version of the data that is released has been thoroughly vetted and the anonymized data, the identifiers are kept totally separate and behind some kind of complete impenetrable wall, then presumably you're fine. I still don't see why you would be saving the identifiers if they're not likely to be needed for some reason, though, long term.
Okay.
Does that help?
If it doesn't, they'll let us know. Thanks, Kristi. Manolis, I'll hand it over to you now.
Thanks a lot, Mark. And I would like also, excuse me, I want to get to the right window. I would like also to thank Kristi for the introduction to identification and anonymization. I'm not certain if you see my presentation. I think it's shared. I think also the last question was a good introductory question for my presentation, because what I'm trying to do with Amnesia is to automate the work that Kristi did manually, and also to go a step forward from pseudonymization. And actually, in the first example here, I will show some weakness of the pseudonymization. Right? With pseudonymization, we usually have the removal of direct identifiers, like Kristi did in her case study. But we are left with quasi-identifiers, which, as Kristi before said, is a kind of secondary descriptive information that can be used to re-identify a person, especially by linking to an external catalog. So the work done by anonymization tools that provide some kind of formal guarantee like K-Anonymity, Amnesia is focused on K-Anonymity at the moment, is to create the equivalence classes, that is groups of identical quasi-identifiers, where it is no longer possible to isolate a specific record that belongs to a person. So think, for example, and this is based on a real example from the United States, that you might have pseudonymized records from hospitals that are shared publicly, and they contain the information that we see on the left cycle on this slide. These have several information that might not be threatening, like the diagnosis or the medication, which is not known to third people and they cannot be used to identify someone. But we have descriptive information, quasi-identifiers, which are the zip code, the birth date, and the gender of a person. And these are dangerous. This is dangerous information because it can be combined with other external catalogs like voters lists. Voters lists are public. They do not have any sensitive information, but they do have some descriptive information. That is, again, the zip code, the birth date, and the gender. So if we combine the pseudonymized data from the hospital with the with open data from the voters list, we can re-identify with high probability most of the records from the pseudonymized data set. So K-Anonymity is solving this problem by creating equivalence classes, so groups with identical quasi-identifiers. For example, if we have this example data set on the left, where the quasi-identifiers is the zip code, dates, and the nationality of a person, then we can get, after anonymizing the data set on the right, which has 3 equivalence classes of with 4 records each, where the information about zip code, dates, and nationality has been obscured. Now, in our algorithms, we use the term generalization. A specific value is replaced by a more generic one. For example, the exact age is now split into 3 age categories: less than 30, 30 to 40, more than 40. what the algorithm does is, given these groupings and the possible substitutions, it can choose automatically. This is what Amnesia does and anonymization algorithms do. You can choose automatically how much is needed to generalize the data in order to create safe groupings. Now, what we cannot avoid, what we have to give as input to the algorithm is these groupings. And it's better if we give a hierarchy of groupings. We term it generalization hierarchy. So the algorithm can try several different substitutions, starting from the most specific to the most generic one. This is the work that Kristi described previously, that she had to do manually, the creating of the groups that replace the original data. And if you do it manually, you have a lot of variables. It's a very complicated task. But Amnesia can automate this for you. And if you give it many possible generalizations for a value, it will choose loses, but at the same time, it creates. For example, here we have a generalization hierarchy that says, you can replace the exact value, the exact age with decades, and if this is not enough, then try to replace them with 20-year periods, and we could have that going up till you completely suppress or delete the age of. I'm describing this process because when we're going to see how Amnesia works, this is a part of the input that has to be given in a way from the user. Now, the strength of K-Anonymity is that it is one of the simplest guarantees for anonymity. So it's easy to understand. It can be the basis of consent. People can understand and say, okay, I'm okay. It's quite close to several existing legal definitions, and compared to other privacy guarantees, it does not distort the data a lot. It has a low information loss. Its weakness is that it's not very strict. I mean, compared to pseudonymization, it's a lot better, but there are more strict privacy guarantees. But these offer more security in exchange for lower data quality. So there's several challenges for anonymization. It has not been extensively used in practice. It now arises in many contexts as a requirement, but we do not have many anonymized datasets available freely. So there are some dangers that may have been overlooked, and we do not know yet how useful anonymized datasets remain for research, because if you destroy the accuracy of the data in several cases, then the research models might not work at all. So we created an Amnesia to simplify this task, and it's available in 2 versions. It's available online, mostly for demonstration and training purposes, but you can download it and use it on your own environment safely without any data ever leaving your premises. And this is my suggestion for anonymizing data. It is focused on K-anonymity, and it works for fixed length delimited records or records of arbitrary length. While it's available as a beta version, we still have bugs. we're still developing it. So if you use it and you have any feedback, I'll be glad to hear it. So I think I'll go directly to show you an example. I'll stop sharing my screen for a second and I'll be back.
And while Manolis is doing that, I'll just highlight that one of our colleagues, put a link to an open source data privacy with R resource into the chat window. So if you haven't seen that, you may want to take a look at that. Go ahead, Manolis.
Okay, now this is the main site of Amnesia, and you can download it from here, or you can use the online version as I'm going to do now. Okay, the first step is to upload a data set. I have a dataset with synthetic medical data for the previous project. The first steps are similar to the Excel import files, where you have to define the delimiter, and then Amnesia guesses the type of the data. You can check and uncheck data to leave fields that are relevant or the direct identifiers out. I'm going to leave the direct identifiers and few fields out, mainly to just keep a smaller data set for demonstration purposes. So I have loaded this data set. Okay, this data set has diagnosis codes, which I do not consider them as a quasi-identifier, and also has descriptive data, which are the date of birth, marital status, and gender. Now that I have loaded the original data set, I have to instruct the algorithm on how to create the groupings for the equivalence classes. Now, we do have a graphical tool where you can edit and create a hierarchy. You can auto-generate the hierarchy. That's it. You tell the algorithm to collect values from the existing data set and then group them to groups of your desired size. But if you auto-generate it, then it's not easy. Semantic similarity between different values might be lost. It works better if you have continuous values like age, and you can then specify steps and time periods. But if you have categorical values like products of the supermarket, you cannot in some way instruct the algorithm how to group them together. For this case, I have prepared several hierarchies. I have prepared one for dates. Now, the hierarchy actually says that each year is split up in months and months to dates. So these dates that exist in the data set, they can be replaced by the month, which is April of 1960 here. And if this is not enough to create equivalence classes of the desired size, then you can just keep only the year. And if that's not enough, then remove date completely. So I'm loading this hierarchy to Amnesia so it can be used in the anonymization purpose. I'm loading a trivial hierarchy for gender and one for marital status. Provided all the that Amnesia requires, and I have to do now is instruct Amnesia which hierarchy to use on which field. So for the date of use the respective hierarchy, for marital status, the respective one, and for gender, the one that we loaded before. We have several algorithms that provide the same result. It's just for performance purposes that we have more than one. And I'm giving it a k value. I'm using a small k because the data set is small, and you will, if I use a large one, you won't see something interesting. And then when the algorithm ends, it gives me this lattice. Now, every node here represents a different solution. We had three quasi-identifiers that were the birth date, the birth date, the marital status, and the gender. Now, each node signifies a different solution where the anonymization algorithm has chosen a different level of generalization for each of these quasi-identifiers. For example, in this node, it has kept only the year, and it has generalized one level up in the generalization hierarchy, the marital status. On this node, it has again kept only the date of birth. It has preserved the original marital status, but it has destroyed the information on gender. Because we don't know the needs of the researcher or the one who does the anonymization, by double-clicking and applying to each of these nodes, it can create a different anonymization solution. The blue ones are those that guarantee K-anonymity. The red ones are those that do not. But there's a small detail. If you see this data, then 99% of the data actually preserve K-anonymity. They belong to equivalence classes that have at least 3 records. It's only 0.74% that violate the K-anonymity. So we can choose to suppress this data instead of choosing a solution that would lose more information. So now we have deleted a few rows, but we have created an anonymization, which is on the right here, that has preserved more accuracy on 90% of the records. I know that we still have work to do on simplifying how this works. So feedback is important. So for people who are not accustomed to anonymization or not aware for the whole model of K-anonymity, it can be complicated, but we will make efforts to make it as simple as possible. And I would like to hear everybody's feedback on that. That's the whole process. We plan to make it more automatic to be able to save a process and then reapply it automatically to new data sets that are similar. Some internal weaknesses that are not weaknesses of Amnesia but generalization in general is that if you have too many variables, as Kristi mentioned about keeping census data, then it's very difficult to find to anonymize the data and still preserve some data accuracy. Now here I had 3 fields, date of birth, marital status, and gender, that were quasi-identifiers. If I have 20 or 30 fields, then in order to create groups of 3 or 5 or 10 records with identical quasi-identifiers, I would probably have to generalize them too much or completely remove them, and the resulting information would be anonymous, but it would preserve too little of the original information. So I think this concludes my presentation of Amnesia. Again, you can find it here. You can use it. If you have any problem, you can comments or ask us. We're in the process of, so new versions will be coming up regularly. Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks, Manolis. That was a good example of what an automated tool can do. And it's interesting for me because I just I had a conversation with a journalist earlier today who's doing a piece on why it's sometimes hard to get data, whether it's kind of government data or research data. And the 4 categories I highlighted as reasons why it sometimes is a challenge to make data accessible. One of them was the effort needed to do things like protect privacy and anonymize data. So clearly tools like Amnesia can help facilitate and make that effort a little less onerous. We do have one question here for you, Manolis. Since you can choose different anonymization strategies as you showed, can you only choose one for the data set that you release? In other words, does releasing the same data set with different anonymization strategies increase the risk of a successful attack?
Yes, it does. If you release the same data set under many different anonymization, so then data can be combined and you can have successful attacks. You can choose different ones, but at the end of the day, you have to choose only one. You can try them. You can see what you lose in every case, but you have to publish or share only one. Or if you share them under NDAs or with different partners and not publicly, then you can rely on that, on providing different entities with different anonymizations depending on their needs. But if the same entity receives different anonymizations for the same data set, then it could theoretically violate the K-Anonymity guarantee.
Okay, thanks, Manolis. And just listening to, it's a great question. And looking at your demonstration and listening to the answer, it strikes me that a tool like Amnesia is also potentially an extremely valuable training tool for, whether it's early career researchers or those just getting into more kind of quantitative research. This could be a very useful way to educate researchers about the nature of data and anonymization. Sorry, go ahead.
This is part why we made the effort to make it this flexible. For example, we could choose the best solution according to some information loss metric, but we want to give the flexibility to users because there's no experience yet. Nobody knows really the impact or some dangers. So people have to try, and researchers to try the tool and try different things.
Right. So we have a couple more minutes. There are no other questions in chat or QA, so I'll just give people an opportunity to type any other questions you may have into the Q&A. And while we're waiting to see if anybody has other questions, I'll just ask Manolis first, and then Kristi, did you have anything else you wanted to say before we do finish up?
I think I showed most of the things I had about Amnesia. What I would be very interested is if anyone tries it on his own research data and then tries to do to apply the queries that did on original data or the models that she or he used on original data to apply them to anonymized data. For me, this is an important question to see the impact of anonymization and anonymized data on research accuracy.
Right. Yeah. Important question. Kristi, anything else you wanted to say?
I just wanted to thank Manolis. That was very interesting and informative. I now know a lot more about Amnesia than I was able to figure out on my own. If anyone is interested in other anonymization packages, I went through quite a few of the commonly recommended ones, and I'm willing to share my observations privately. So feel free to send me questions after. I just want to emphasize that to me, the real problem that most of these packages have is that the algorithms are opaque. Many of the researchers who need them the most are not going to have a very good basis for choosing what algorithm to use. And the end user of the data set, who is even more removed from what was done, may not understand how exactly the changes made to the data set will affect the analysis they're using. So I really think that there needs to be a default towards much simpler to understand tools, something that is more straightforward, aimed at the baseline user, and that makes fairly solid recommendations rather than showing a solution space, because most researchers that I know, at least in the social sciences, are going to just leave at that point. This is not a generalization. There are many people who would just love to dive into this sort of thing, but there are many others who wouldn't.
All right, thanks, Kristi. And certainly I know the interest in data security and anonymization is high, because in our, when Canary did a community consultation before the Research Data Management Funding Program, that was identified as one of the top gaps or opportunities, I suppose, in terms of developing infrastructure. And certainly with the submissions that we received, there were a number that had this question or this issue of security of data and anonymization. So I think this is a pretty important topic and a hot one that has a lot of interest. So we'll see. I'll certainly be interested in any thoughts that people who attended the webinar today may have on additional topics that we could put on, excuse me, put on in this area. So I don't see any additional questions in the Q&A or chat, and we are pretty close to the end of the webinar time. So I'll take this opportunity to remind everybody that we will make the webinar recording, that's the full audio and video of the slides, available typically within a day or two after this is done, although Canary does have its national summit coming up in the next couple of days, so there may be an additional delay. Anybody who registered for the webinar will receive an email notification when the recording is available. So thanks again to everyone for attending, and obviously to Manolis and Kristi for their expertise and taking the time to provide that expertise to us on the webinar. So thank you both, and thanks again, everybody, and feel free to send any of us a note as follow-ups, as Kristi and Manolis suggested.
Thanks a lot, Mark, for organizing it.
You bet. Thanks, Manolis, and thanks again, Kristi. And I'll let you both know when the recording is available.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
All right. Cheers.
Cheers.
Cheers.